Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Strand. My name is Sabir, and I direct events here. For a little bit of history, Strand was founded in 1927 by the Bass family over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled until after over 92 years, Strand is the sole survivor, still run by the Bass family, and still housing new and used books. Tonight, we're happy to welcome Kate Mosse to the Rare Book Room to discuss her brand new book, The Burning Chamber, a novel set in 16th century France. Kate is the author of 6 novels and short story collections, including the #1 multi-million selling Languedoc Trilogy, Labyrinth, Sepulchre and Citadel. She also has written 3 works of nonfiction, 4 plays, and is curating a collection of short stories inspired by Wuthering Heights to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Emily Bronte's birth in 2018. Her documentary on the writer and classicist Helen Waddell will be broadcast by the BBC in 2019. Joining Kate in conversation is novelist and classicist Madeline Miller. Madeline grew up in New York City and Philadelphia. She attended Brown University, where she earned her BA and MA in classics. The Song of Achilles, her first novel, was awarded the 2012 Orange Prize for Fiction and was a New York Times bestseller. It has been translated into over 25 languages. Her second novel, Circe, was an instant #1 New York Times bestseller and won the 2018 Elle Big Book Award. Madeline's essays have appeared in a number of publications, including The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Telegraph, and Lampoon's. Please join me in welcoming Kate and Madeline to Strand.
Catastrophe is stool. I wouldn't have come if I'd known it was a stool.
Okay. Hello, is this on? Can everyone hear? Okay, great. I am so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Kate, for thinking of me to do this. It has been such a pleasure to know you as a writer, as an activist, as a feminist, as a person who stands up for women's voices. So this book is really exciting and is very much in the line of standing up for women's voices. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about sort of Minou, who's the main character. She's the daughter of a bookseller, Catholic. What drew you to her story in particular?
Well, it's a delight for me. Madeline, you all know, is a superstar. But we've known each other ever since Madeline won the Women's Prize. So we'll talk a bit about that a bit later.
She made me a superstar.
You're so kind. No. So the thing for me, and I know this is opposite to you, is that Minou, who is the lead character in this novel, the people are never the first thing that comes to me. So the lead character in all my books is landscape. And it's the idea that if you shut your eyes and you listen, you can hear the voices of the past in the landscape. And if you like, that the truth of human history lies more there than it does in the people that write it, because people write things partially and they write from their own point of view and to get benefits, all of that. So for me, the story of this really came from the idea of neighbours, I suppose, in an odd sort of way. It's set against the backdrop of the French Wars of Religion. They start on the 1st of March, 1562. And I was just really haunted by the fact that the day before it happened, and it started with a massacre a long way from Carcassonne, where I write about, in the southwest of France. But the day before, when Minou went to work in her father's bookshop in Carcassonne, she says good morning to her Catholic neighbours, she's a Catholic, and to her Protestant neighbours, and to her Jewish neighbours. There are many Jewish people that have fled to that part of France because there is toleration. And on that day, that's okay. Then the next day, things happen elsewhere, and people are suddenly told, you cannot, that person is no longer your friend, they are your enemy. And I was just rather haunted by that. So it's a Romeo and Juliet story at the end of it, a Catholic girl and a Protestant boy, but more about all of our stories, what happens when the people that rule us tell us that that person is your enemy. And that's really the story of the wars of religion. So out of that came Minou as the girl who's going to tell the story for me.
Yes. Well, I think you captured that so beautifully, is how quickly those things can turn. That, one conflagration, one massacre, and suddenly, it happens in a day. And I think it was also, I loved how you situated her also as sort of because she is the daughter of a bookseller, and books are naturally going out to the maximum number of people, and they're all different kinds of books. So I feel like that was a perfect choice to kind of allow her to have a wider view of the world than she might have had if she weren't that.
Exactly. And I mean, one of the reasons, obviously we're in this wonderful and iconic bookshop here, but it was just one of those fascinating bits of research for me that within Europe, there was this huge seismic change. You all know this. Religious war is never about faith. It's always about power. It's always about getting advantage and all of these things. But one of the odd, unforeseen, wonderful consequences of the Reformation in Europe and the awfulness of all the nuns and the monks being kicked out of the places they'd lived, all the libraries, these incredible religious libraries being looted, was that in every town, bookshops opened. So it's this strange unintended consequence of something awful, was that bookselling and mass reading became much more commonplace in Europe. And so, of course, she needed to be in a bookshop, I felt. But as you say, her father sells all sorts of books on the idea that the more widely we read, the richer we are, the more voices we hear, the better it is. When, of course, overnight, he's being told those books are banned. Those books must leave your bookshop. And if you don't get rid of the bookshop, those books, then we will arrest you. So it's that turning of history that is so quick that fascinates me.
Yeah. Well, I love that. So you're the Romeo in your Romeo and Juliet story, who is a Huguenot. His name is Piet. I checked beforehand. It's spelled Piet. And so he has this beautiful thing where he says, tolerance and dignity and freedom. Piet was ready to lay down his life to defend these principles. He was engaged in a battle for the very soul of France, a battle that would define how men could live and be free. And I think we are at a moment right now in many countries in the world where we feel that we are battling for tolerance and dignity and freedom. And I guess I wanted to ask, how much were those resonances in your mind as you were writing?
Well, I think, I'm defined as a historical fiction writer, and you're not. But we are both doing the same thing, which is animating stories set in the past. In your case, the far distant mythological past. But finding the common ground between the humanity that we all share and the things that are specific about any particular place and time. Now, with historical fiction, the minute you put on your 21st century eyes, it fails. Because I am a woman, a feminist writing in the 21st century. I have certain expectations, I've had different experiences, all of these things. I cannot write Minou with my set of values and expectations because it is just untrue in all sorts of ways. Women's lives were different. And yet, the feeling that any woman who has a child feels if that child dies, I do not believe that my heart and Minou's heart in 1562 react differently. When the soldiers bang on the door, whether that is Carcassonne in the Resistance in 1944, whether it is Minou in 1562, whether it is any of us now, I think our heart jumps the same. So for me, within historical fiction, I am absolutely not thinking about what the madness that appears to be going on now in the world. How has this happened? But we know how it happens because history is a pendulum. Sadly, it isn't things getting better and people learning more and a genuine shared belief that things should be better for everybody, regardless of what they look like, regardless of the faith, regardless of their gender, all of these things. That's not, sadly, how it goes. When I started researching the book, the idea that there would be an absolute rollback of tolerance, the absolute idea that there would be a renewal of racial bigotry, and not that these things ever went away, but it would be everyday conversation as opposed to, God, did you just hear what they said? And people being shocked. Yeah. That was not in my mind at all. So I have to keep absolutely honorably close to the history of the time and make sure that my women and my men behave appropriately. Do I want the reader to bring our world to their reading? Yes, I do. Because I think that there are always moments in any, the mechanics of war, particularly religious war, there is a moment when a different story could have been told. Yeah. And it is our responsibility as human beings now to try and recognize that moment and not cross the line. And what happened in the wars of religion was precisely that there was a moment at which a different story could have been told. And instead, they knew in France expelling the Huguenots would destroy the country, that it was about a few men at the top seeking power over the young king. They knew that, but they did it anyway. And that kind of haunts me, that sort of moment of history, the moment at which you could have changed it. So, Minou and Piet, they are utterly themselves. And what I want from any of my readers is, will they make it? Yeah. Will they survive? Will they find each other again? Will they be their own good selves intact? Will they not do terrible things in order to survive? Yeah. But then beyond that, I want readers to think, oh, that's how that happened. And of course, there are things that are terribly similar. I would say particularly in the Huguenot story, there are a great deal of echoes, obviously, with what happened to Jewish people in France. And that's, of course, why when I'm in France having these stories, these conversations, the questions are very different. Because people remember the moment at which it could have been a different story, and they didn't act. So,
Wow, that's really interesting. I would love to hear more, actually, just about how these works have been received, how this has been received in France.
Well, this one is not actually out in France yet, for reasons that are various and too dull to go into. But they're about to be out in France. But I've just been in France getting a medal,
Wow,
which is very exciting, as an English person who loves France. And it was very French. And anyone who knows France will know what I mean by that, which means that the mayor talks for a long time. And he talks in language that is essentially Shakespeare. And so my French is good, but there was a moment at which I clearly screamed out. And everybody is standing looking at the mayor. And it's hilarious. It's absolutely hilarious. And I was just standing and I was tired and I kind of drifted away and I suddenly realized he had actually asked me a question and I had missed the question. And there was no way of rolling back this. Unfortunately, my wonderful husband was there and he stepped up and he said, I think what my wife would like to say, and I started, I was like, I would like to say that. That's brilliant answering. But I think the thing to say is about The Burning Chambers that it's an adventure story. I mean, it's historical fiction, it's a thriller. It is the story of two people. It's the story of forbidden love. You know, what happens if you fall in love with the wrong person? That could be, in any period of time, wrong for a different reason. It could be because, we're here in glorious New York. It's so wonderful seeing the celebration of Pride here. We don't have anything like this. I mean, we do have Pride. But not every shop, I mean, obviously, we have Pride, blah. What I mean is we don't have every shop window and all of these things. And so, it could be that. It could be because somebody is disabled and is differently abled and you're not supposed to do that, or different color skin, and, we know all of these things. But so at the heart of it, it's a story of forbidden love. And it's a story of a missing relic, and it's a story of a feud that will last 300 years. And these are the things that inspire me to write. I'm a storyteller. That's what I'm doing. I put imagined people against the backdrop of real history because I think in historical fiction we stand in other people's shoes. We can be other than ourselves. And I celebrate that, and I have it always in my books. I have characters that would be defined differently. I'm never writing a gay story. That's not my story to write, but are there always gay characters in my novels? Yeah, because everybody was there. Yeah. Are there always people of colour in my... Absolutely, yeah, they're all there. But in the end, for me, what I want is a great story. What I want everybody to say is, I could not put that book down. And then start the conversations about all these other things, if you see what I mean. I think that's where our purpose is, in a way, sometimes different. We've talked about this before, that you have such beautiful characters and such beautiful language. And that sort of wonderful blending is where you start, whereas I start with adrenaline in place. and that's in a way why I'm a historical fiction writer and adventure writer, and you're not defined in that way. We do it slightly differently. But I mean, in answer to the question that you asked about 2 years ago, about France, with my earlier novels, I was concerned about that. I think that idea of appropriating other people's stories, it's different when you're a white English woman and they're white French people. But it is still cultural appropriation in a different sort of way, because I'm not French. And I did worry when I first was in Carcassonne that people would think, well, this is a real cheek. How is this terribly English person, she's come down, and I really am awfully English, come down and they're in Carcassonne and telling our story. So the story of the Cathars and now the story of the Huguenots in Carcassonne. And I do a bit, events there, they're big events you do there, and everybody comes, and they're half in English, half in French, and it's why everybody drinks, because you just never survive the entire event, because it goes on for such a long time. And in the end, I had the confidence to ask somebody at a book signing, and I said, I'm just very interested. I was worried that people in Carcassonne would resent me telling their story. And the woman looked me in the eye and she said, better an English woman than a Parisian.
Interesting.
And that's the Second World War for you.
Wow.
That's
amazing.
Yeah, one of my earlier novels was set in the Second World War, the Resistance. And that the South will never, never forgive the North for rolling over and for pursuing a policy of genocide against Jewish people that they weren't even asked for in the first place. And Carcassonne in the southwest of France is incredibly proud of the fact that 30,000 of the 40,000 Jewish people who survived were saved out of the networks in the south. And I say that not because this is anything to do with the burning chambers, but it is about where my inspiration comes from, the spirit of place. That there is a spirit of place, of independence of thought, of toleration in the south, in Carcassonne, that goes from the Cathars and that religious toleration to the Huguenots in the burning chambers and the books that will follow, that goes all the way through to the behaviour of the South in the Second World War. And that is also something that I try to honour, the idea that there is a certain sort of spirit about, okay, our leaders have told us we must behave like this, but we don't think that's right, so we're not going to. And that's, of course, why all my fiction are love letters to Carcassonne. Because it's just, I feel, that's how everywhere should be.
Well, that was going to be my next question. Why? But that's amazing. What an amazing, and obviously that sort of culture will build on itself. That if you're able to be successful with resistance, and that then you will do it again and again, and it becomes this sort of entrenched mutual value, which is wonderful.
Yes, and I think I link back to Labyrinth, which The Burning Chambers is the most like Labyrinth of any book I've written. And I had the same joy in the writing of it, having not been able to really write or be a full-time writer for quite a few years for reasons. And so it felt like starting a new, writing for the first time again, and that was very joyous. But one of the things that I've enjoyed so much about The Burning Chambers and writing it is exactly that thing, that out of research comes a lot of the stories that you don't know. And it just reminds you that all history, it's a cliche to say that history is written by the victors. It's true, and that's why it's a cliche, but, we know that. But actually, I think the thing that we often forget is that history is written with an agenda. And this is very important for what you do and I do in our different ways in our books. Because at the heart of this for me, not just Minou, but other characters in it, is telling untold women's stories. And that the history that we are told about the past is almost always leaves the women out. And the women who appear, particularly in the 16th century, it's only queens and princesses and mistresses of the wealthy. There are no female leaders in religious terms that appear, and there are no female leaders in terms of military. So essentially, our views of the 16th century are stories of men. But, and a correlation to that is that women sat at home sewing. That was it. So, and often these things are used to justify trying to roll back women's rights by saying, well, in the past women did that, you know, and it was good in the past. Right. And then you say, but this isn't true, my dear, because if, as had been the case, France had been at war with Italy, with England, with Spain, as it had for 30 years before the wars of religion broke out, well, who do we think were opening the shops? The men weren't there. They were at war. So for me, one of the important things about this, and why all my heroes are women, and Minou is an important character and other characters in the book, is that sometimes through fiction, I think you can start to say, let's just use some common sense here. Where are the women's voices? They're completely absent from almost all Elizabethan and Tudor history, unless you're Queen Elizabeth I or Catherine de' Medici, and most of us were not. In fact, 99% of us were not. So for me also within the storytelling, the fact that it's an adventure story, it's a hero-led story, it is about finding something out, solving it, being brave, being courageous. It's very important to me that my heroes are women. Because for me, the hero is the protagonist. It isn't to do with what bits and pieces you've got,
well,
if any, you know.
Right. Well, I feel like the passion of that really comes through in the story. And one of the things that I so appreciated is that, as you say, there many, most of the major characters are female, and they come from all different backgrounds, and in particular, they have all different ages, which I feel like is very unusual to have sort of a powerful young woman, powerful older women, and to allow all those different voices. So I wanted to ask, was that something you were thinking about in terms of staggering the ages?
Yes, that's a lovely question, and it's very, very important to me. I think one of my great heroines, because she would hate it if I said it otherwise, in literature is Miss Marple. I don't know if any of you have read Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, but I have always loved the utter subversion of that. So whatever you're told as a reader there is, that she's an annoying, unmarried, equaling, therefore not so important, busybody who sits knitting, garments for people. Oh, but she happens to solve all the crimes. I mean, you wouldn't want to go anywhere near where she lived because everybody seems to die. But, I mean, there is that thing. But if you actually then... Agatha Christie has created the most subversive female character there. Because why? She's the person who solves it. She is the person who saves the community. She is the hero. And I've spent the last 10 years caring for my father and my mother, and I still care for my mother-in-law, and she is a wonderful woman. And my godmother died a couple of years ago, and she was an Anglican nun, and she was 104. And I come from a family of very long-living women, who on the surface are all very traditional, nuns. My aunt founded the movement for the ordination of women in the UK with 12 other women, and it was very moving when she was ordained. So I come from a family of what look like very traditional women doing traditional things, who are just the most incredibly inspiring and extraordinary people. So out of that, it was that real sense, not only my real life, but actually the truth of the world, that there is a great liberation for older women in certain societies being older. In the Cathar society, many wealthy women decided to just leave their families and just go and be Cathars on their own, And suddenly they were no longer subject to a husband's rule and all of these things. So again, for me, it's about common sense. often when you see films, often when you read books, you would be forgiven for thinking that only white men and women between the ages of 25 and 35 existed. We know that's not true in the world. And so in my fiction, what I want is, to have all sort of ages. So I always have old women in my book, and they're always the ones that know because they are overlooked, so everybody just talks in front of them. Yeah. They're basically cab drivers. Yeah. Think of them like the cab drivers. So people sit in the back of the car and they think, oh, nobody can hear what I'm saying. Yeah. You go, mate, we've just heard everything you've said, and we know that, your husband's going to have a nasty old time when he gets home. We know this. So I always have those sorts of characters in the book, and one of my favorite characters I've ever written is Aunt Mosse. Yeah. And she, Nettie likes her. And again, she's a very interesting character for me. She's an aunt. I needed her, so opposite how you write, you see in your voices. Minou needs to go to Toulouse. She needs to go to Toulouse because, well, I won't tell you because you might read the book and then I'll spoil it. But trust me, she needs to go to Toulouse. And she wouldn't go to stay in a house if there were not a senior female relative in that house. She wouldn't be allowed to go. So I needed an older woman. That was it. That's where she came from. And then I was writing her, and she's fussy and annoying, and she's a rich Catholic woman. She's only interested in her clothes. And in that day and age, it's a lot of conversation about people's ruffs and their cuffs, because this was the one thing that people could wash. Right. And they denoted wealth, and it's ridiculous, obviously, but people's collars got bigger and bigger. The richer you were, the sort of more insanely big your collar was, and your ruff. And so then I was writing her, and she was twitters around all the time. And then I had the moment that I love as a writer, which was a real massacre. I don't like massacres, but as a writer, they're really useful. And I had found out that there'd been a massacre in Toulouse a long time before the most famous massacre of the Wars of Religion. And that I suddenly realized, of course, my girl could be there, Minou could be there, Piet could be there, and this is how it could work. And so they are going, and there was a trigger that happened a couple of weeks before this. And it's the most extraordinary story, a piece of true history, where, this is the Romeo and Juliet again, where a Protestant funeral, a Huguenot funeral is taking place. A woman has died. She is converted. Her Catholic family have never accepted that, and they intercept the funeral cortege and try to steal the coffin. This is of historical record that I found in the archives. They fight, the coffin falls, the body falls out. Now, we all know how, again, it doesn't matter if it's 1562, we know that would be the most appalling thing. And I have a scene, and I was writing the scene of Minou putting her hand out to touch her aunt, and I found myself writing her aunt. She pulled her arm away. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Why she pulled her arm away? Because that's how it is for me when I'm writing. I'm as surprised as the reader will be as to what the hell is actually going on. In a first draft, I obviously sorted it out later. And then I found myself writing a description of her sleeve coming down and thinking, oh, her arm's covered in bruises. Oh, I see, you're not a silly woman at all. You're an abused woman, and this is all why you're like this. And I swear that what it felt like was that she turned around and was like, about time. I've been waiting for you to see me, Kate, and you've taken a long time to see me. But it's joyous, that kind of writing. Because then, of course, I knew that she was she was a completely different sort of person. And it really felt like she put her foot on the page and said, you have thought all this time that I'm in the chorus, and I'm a supporting lead. And I said, I am so sorry. I thought you were just in the chorus being annoying, and here you are a supporting lead. And out of that, because the thing I should say is that as well as writing very strong female characters, what I also feel very strongly about is writing gentle and beautiful male characters. Because for me, it's the same flip. It's like, what about the men who don't want to go around cutting everybody's head off? Yeah. What about those lovely gentlemen who are not allowed to be themselves either? So, for me, it's common sense all the way around.
Yeah. Well, I since we're here talking about, you alluded to the roughs and your research, this is a book that is both incredibly, tremendously well researched, but wears that really lightly, which is, I think, a hard thing to do. You know, to when you get to sort of some item of, you know, this knife or this type of water, to not then, you know, tell the reader 10 pages of what you've researched about that. So tell me a little bit about your research and how you sort of titrate out the right amount.
Well, I would say my research divides absolutely in two, and half of it's there and most of it's there in my feet. And it's right back to your lovely question at the beginning about where things come from. For me, it's the physicality of the landscape and the walking endlessly those spaces until, although I'm now the woman I am now in this year or whatever the year I'm doing the research, what I'm seeing is then. Yeah. And then it's about how I convey that to you so that when you go to Carcassonne now, or in book number 2, Amsterdam, or book number 3, America, with the Huguenots, you will be able to stand there and say, oh, yes, I can now imagine what it was like then. And so 90% of my research never appears in the book. Because I feel that readers, if you read historical fiction, you have the right to expect that I know. Yeah. And that you don't need me to prove that I know. Yep. That when I say the wars of religion started on the 1st of March 1562, you can trust that that's right. You know? And it's also things like the research with, you know, dates. So what I have is I have a timeline of the real history, and then I have a timeline of my characters' lives, because I'm always forgetting, you know, are they 6 now? Is that child 8? How old is that child? You know, so I have their kind of birth dates and things like that. But I don't have any plan of chapters beyond that. So for me, it's the physicality of the place and the idea that the bookshop is there and the medieval city is there and all of this. And then with the research, a lot of my story comes out of research. So that massacre and the stealing of the coffin in Toulouse, people often say, you can't do your own research, do you? And I say, of course, because if I had not been doing my research, I never would have found that. I never could have said, can you go and see if anybody dropped a coffin? Yeah. Because obviously, that's ridiculous. Yeah. But out of that comes, the inspiration for me of the storytelling. And I think the other thing with research about walking is that some of the things that I do in terms of the descriptions of costume that people wear, you don't have to tell you everything about a piece of clothing for the 1560s. What you want to know is, when I describe something, why does it matter? So when Minou is running away from the soldiers, what's she got on her feet? Can she run? That's why it matters. Yep. And if she's going to climb through a window, now you all will have seen European pictures of the 16th century, and you will have seen essentially costumes. Mm-hmm. You will have seen Elizabeth I with those big... Did she go around like that every day? No, she did not. Of course she didn't. So what were normal women wearing? But I need to know that, so if Minou is climbing the city walls, can she climb through a window? Are her skirts too big? So for me, the question is always about research. Why does the reader need to know that? Yeah. And mostly, they don't. So my files of research are, I mean, my books are long. You should see, you see my research. And also, you never know. Yeah. You never know what it is that will release something in the story.
That's absolutely right. I totally resonate with that. So I'm going to pause for a second and turn it over to questions, because I imagine some of you have questions about this wonderful book and Kate's history. So I think there's a microphone that can go around.
Yes, if you'll just raise your hand, I can run the mic to you.
Anyone?
It's always hard doing a Q&A for a book that's just come out that nobody's read. It's that, isn't it, really? So.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. You talked about books 2 and 3 in this series. Are you willing to reveal what's coming up?
Yes, and 4 actually as well. And that was an accident. It was my husband pointed out to me wonderfully. it's got to be said, numeracy was never quite my thing. And he pointed out that if I intended to cover 300 years of history in 3 books, everybody would have to live to be about 120, and that was probably unlikely. So I said, four. Yes, I can. I mean, what this book, The Burning Chambers, begins... I grew up on the 19th century novel. That was my love. And for many of you, you will know that they often have what we call a framing device. So actually books that, we think of Wuthering Heights as Cathy and Heathcliff, but actually the person who tells that story is Lockwood. He arrives and he closes the story. Actually, one of the great novels, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that is actually told by a captain of the ship that has found creature at the end. And I always use that device in my novels. I enjoy that. And it's also kind of a reassurance, I think, sometimes for the reader that there'll be, it's all going to resolve. You can trust me. But here, the framing device is the end of the series. So the book proper, chapter 1, starts last day of February 1562, and that's where the story tells. But the prologue is in Franschhoek in South Africa in 1862. And this is where really the story came from in the first instance, which was being on an author tour, which Madeline and I were just talking about the fact that we never get anywhere near our writing desks, because we're off talking about writing and not doing it all the time. But I was fortunate enough to be in South Africa. I don't know if any of you know Franschhoek. It's in the wineland district of South Africa, and I was being driven from the airport. We were going down through the winelands, and then I suddenly noticed a sign at the side of the road that said Languedoc, which is the name of the region I write about in France. And this is strange. Then we kept going down, and I started to notice that all the domaines, the wineries, had French names. They didn't have English names or Afrikaans names or Dutch names or Xhosa names or French. They were all French. Petit Provence, Grand Provence, and I thought this is really weird. And then finally we got to the main street of Franschhoek, and it was called Huguenot Street, at which moment I smelt a rat. And I said to my driver, can you just tell me about this? And he just looked at me and he said, oh, don't you know that Franschhoek means the French corner? So when I had time off from my events, I ran to the end of the road, went to the Huguenot Museum there, and went inside and learned a piece of history that just blew my socks off. And it was this, that the wars of religion, as I've been saying, happened in France. They lasted a generation, 1562 to 1598. And then an edict called the Edict of Nantes was signed, giving religious toleration. It was revoked in 1688, and it's known, famously as that. And at that moment, the last remaining Huguenots who had survived had to leave France. And most of them had fled. Many of them had been welcomed in. They were the great refugee crisis of the 16th and 17th century. And the countries that accepted them in had all flourished because of the Huguenots. It's a very interesting, different story from many stories like this, which are always, refugee stories are always of despair and sadness and loss and unfairness. But Huguenot story is very interesting. So Amsterdam was the great refugee city of Europe. Many, many Huguenots had gone to Ireland and to England, as it still then was. Many, of course, had gone into Germany. A handful had come here to America. The oldest existing Huguenot street in the world is in America, interestingly enough, although the French dispute that, obviously, because they're very, fighty, the French. And some had gone to South Africa. And the reason was this, that the governor of the Cape, of the Dutch East India Company, who had obviously invaded and taken the land from the African people whose land it was set up as a staging post to take all the things from Europe to their colonies in the Far East. The governor realized that the land in the Cape was the same as the land in Languedoc in southwest France. So he sent word back to Amsterdam, the headquarters of the East India Company, and said, if there are any French Huguenot winemakers from Languedoc, who have come to Amsterdam as refugees, who are prepared to go to the other side of the world. We will pay for your passage on a ship. We will pay for your families to go with you. We will pay for a French pastor to administer to your spiritual needs. And when you arrive, we will give you money and a farm. And 7 families sailed. And that, in part, is how the South African wine industry started. 7 families of French Huguenots and their allies. And so I walked through the museum, reading all of this, got to the back room of the museum, saw the names of the hundreds of people who had gone, and there, on a ship called the Berg China that had landed in the Cape on the 4th of August, 1688, was the name of a family that I had written about in my novel, Labyrinth. Quite. So at this moment, I was like, ah! And then I thought, no, Kate, no. You know nothing about the Huguenots. You know nothing about the 17th century, and you don't like it, all those stupid wigs. And you know nothing about ships, so that's a disaster. And you know nothing about South Africa, and that is a minefield. But yet, the thing that happened was I went outside and I stood in the Huguenot graveyard. And all of the names there are De Villiers, Jourdain, Joubert, all of the names that came on those ships in 1688. And I suddenly knew it. I knew the whole series, not just the burning chambers where it was going to start, but I knew where it was going to finish more significantly. And I suddenly thought, what if you were a woman standing in this graveyard in 1862, 300 years after the wars of religion had broken out? And you had grown up your entire life hearing stories from your mother and your father and your great-grandmother and your great-grandmother and her great-grandmother, going all the way back to the beginning of the place that they carry in their hearts, home, Languedoc, the place they were forced to flee, having to leave everything behind, but where their hearts remain. And that is your whole story of your family, is the place that you were forced to leave. But what if you stood in this graveyard and you looked up at those mountains, the Franschhoek Mountains that ring that town, and they look like the mountains of Languedoc? And I suddenly thought, all refugee stories are sad. But what about, in the end, a story of hope? Arriving here and knowing that actually this could be home. And that's the prologue, a girl standing in a graveyard, too scared to rub off the moss on the tombstone, because what if everything she's been told, and that name is not the name that she thinks she's going to see? And so then, of course, once I'd got this as an idea, I had to go right back to the beginning, because, of course, any story for me involving the Huguenots is going to start in my beloved Carcassonne, because that's where everything starts for me. So the next book, The City of Tears, is a little bit in Paris with the most famous engagement of the Wars of Religion, which is the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, which the one thing everybody knows about the Wars of Religion is that, when the whole Huguenot leadership was ambushed, essentially, and wiped out in a matter of hours. But it's mostly set in Amsterdam, and the novel is called The City of Tears. And it's about those refugees that went there. And there was a beautiful and very trendy part of Amsterdam called Jourdain. And there was hilarious, when you go on the when you go on the tourist boat, they tell you that that region is called Jourdain, which is spelled Jordaan, because of the River Jordan. And I can tell you the reason it's called that is because it's where the Huguenots settled outside the walls, and they called it Jardin, garden. And it was hilarious. I was thinking, shall I tell them that this is all just made up stuff? And then I thought, no, not yet. So that's set there. And then we leap forward. In book 3, we'll be on the sea. Because each of the books, they have the element there. So the first one is fire, obviously. The burning chambers is the name of the inquisitional chamber, and if you didn't answer right, you were put to the pyre, and that's what they were called, the burning rooms, burning chambers. The second one, of course, is water. The third one is air, so it's partly on the seas. And it will be partly going to South Africa, it'll be partly coming to the New World, because it's a much less well-known story, the Huguenots here, than the Pilgrim Fathers and other stories of people coming here. But it is a fascinating story. And those names are the same names. And then the final book is set in Franschhoek, the frontier town, the beginning of that community. And the really sad and weird story, which is the Huguenots there experienced prejudice and bigotry, but not from the French Catholics, but of course from the Dutch settlers, who didn't want them to speak or worship in French. And so the names disappeared. But it was very moving for me launching the book in South Africa, and people coming up to me and saying, I'm a de Villiers. My family came on that ship. And it's, I find that sort of thing terribly moving and mind-blowing. Anyway, that was a very long answer. But I'm saving the rest of you. I haven't got any questions. So,
I'm an art history major, so the history is big for me. I was wondering, in this point in time, why do you think history is so important to talk about and remember, especially even as far back as the 1500s?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a lovely question. I think it's really important, actually, because of what we're seeing at the moment. What I was saying about Madeleine's work and mine, occupying very different spaces, but at the same time where we have things in common. I think that often when the pendulum swings the wrong way, I'm making an assumption here that we would all share that, very often the past is an enormous part of prosecuting that agenda. In the UK at the moment, it is a very depressing situation. And the people that are making it so and making it ugly are almost without exception talking about the old days, the days before there were these people here and the days before this. But it is a lie. The image that they are painting of those days is not true. And so I think actually in times of difficulty, and I think the world is in times of difficulty at the moment, going back to the real history and saying all of these people were here too. We know all of these people were here too. There was a ludicrous row recently in England about Mary Beard, who is a wonderful woman, a complete hoot and a laugh, and she is the woman you want to go out on the town with, no doubt about that. But saying that, well, of course there were black people in Britain. I mean, it's obvious. The Romans were a colonizing empire with an army from their entire colony. The fuss that was made about that, because the image painted is we were all English. We weren't even English then. Obviously, we were tootling around, all of this. So for me, I think it is really important that we try and put true history, insofar as we can know it, but common sense history, very visibly back, because I think often the people that are trying to do the things they're trying to do are using false history to justify their actions. And that's why I think it matters. And I'm just a novelist, and I'm writing stories. But it's why I think novels matter more sometimes in difficult times, because I think that we all go to our news channels, our non-fiction, our history. For confirmation bias. We read the things that we think are right. What I think novels can do is sneak between the gaps. I think people pick up a novel and they're not expecting, nobody picks up my novels because they think, do you know what? I really need to know about the Reformation in France. Because if they want that, they're going to read a history book. But what I like the idea is that my readers have all sorts of different political points of view. But I love it when people say, oh, I didn't realize there were women doing that. Because that's what novels are sneaky, and they slip between what we know and what we can imagine. So I think historical fiction is really important at the moment, but it's why 90% of my research is not in the book, because you've got to do the research to make sure that you don't perpetuate lies, actually.
How do you know when to stop researching and start writing? Do you ever find yourself procrastinating by researching?
There's an old saying, because I have a lot to do with writing and not just my own, and I used to be a publisher. The joke is always that when the writer in question has got as far in terms of general housework as bleaching the spoons, you've done enough research. So you know you've suddenly got to a moment where it's avoiding writing. And it is often for me that moment when I suddenly think, do you really need to know the size of that buckle on that shoe, Kate? When you're just saying, just one more bit of research and then I'll start. And I think we all have an internal clock on that. But many writers do it differently. I do my research up front and then I start writing. And my first draft is always emotional, as it were, and my second and third draft are intellectual. And what I mean by that is I just splurge it all out first time round. I write like a mad person, 7 days a week, 8-9 hours a day, just to get something down, because I don't know what book I'm writing till I've done that. Then the next bit is about filling in the gaps, saying that doesn't work, this character doesn't work, moving all of these things around. And the research, therefore, for me is a very big part of it. I have other friends who research as they go along, and I can't imagine doing that because I feel I need to know everything before I start. But you just learn, I think, when it's becoming avoidance. And there's always a moment when you tip. Do you not find that there's always a moment when you know that you need to start writing now?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a weird situation because I have this whole background in classics, so
Yeah.
I sort of have done the research up front. But so the part of the research I do is I research as I go now. But
yes, because you've got it all, haven't you?
Yes,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's true that there is that moment where you think, I'm pretty deep in this like weaving thing here. I think I can pull out and use it, and if I can always go back to it. I can always go back to it.
Yeah, ballistics is another one.
Oh yeah.
Weapons.
Yeah, weapons.
Yeah. Actually doing those things. I've actually had sword fighting lessons because I live and I have a lot of association with theatres, so it was very handy to be able to go and say, could you do that? Because actually those things for me do feel quite important. What does it feel like to hold a sword, and could you even lift it? And all of these things. And so, I think those things are quite important. But then there comes a moment when it's like, enough now. enough now, prancing around in the theatre.
Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering what advice both of you have for aspiring authors.
Yeah. You go.
Oh, me first?
Yeah, I think
Thanks.
so.
I think that my biggest piece of advice is that I think it's really easy to get discouraged because you sort of write something and maybe it's not so great, and then you work on it a little and it's still not so great, and you realize you have to cut all of it and start over. And I feel like that when you're writing in isolation, particularly as a young writer, you sort of feel like you're the only one who's blowing it and who can't get it. But that is the experience of every writer that I know. And Anne Patchett talks about how it's kind of like you turn on the taps and like a bunch of sludge has to come out before you get to the clean water. And I think that's absolutely right. So I think young writers often give up too soon. Or, I wrote 2 horrible novels in college that will never see the light of day. But that was my sludge, and I had to, turn on the tap. And I don't even know if I could they're on some antique computer that would need an archivist to get it off. But I don't want them because they were just practice. They were my practice. And so I think being willing to do that and sort of not thinking in terms of oftentimes and things like the National Novel Writing Month, which I think can be wonderful, but also puts this emphasis on how many pages did you write today? How many words did you write today? And I think that's actually a little bit of a misleading emphasis because sometimes the answer is, negative 50 pages. But that is progress to cut those pages. So just allowing yourself to have room to try and fail and try again, and to just know that is absolutely part of the process. And that's the process for every writer, no matter what they may tell you. That's the process for every writer.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. You know, people don't realize that all of our first drafts are horrifying. And, you know, but I think the most important one is to write. And then that sounds like a silly thing to say. But I think, and you will have had this, you know, when you've given advice, too many people are waiting for the perfect moment to write their book. But it's like getting fit or doing your scales on the piano. You need to write every day in order to be ready when the time comes, when you are intellectually, emotionally, and you have the time to write your book. So take the fear out of writing, of the blank page. Because I think that's often what happens. People will say, you know, I've got this great idea, and I say, great, what are you writing? And they'll say, well, no, I haven't got time to write it. And the truth is that you've got time every single day to write a description of what the steam coming out of the kettle looks like. You don't have to write your novel every day, but just get your muscles ready to go so that when you have got your voice or you are ready to do it, you're fit. You're fit for writing. So I think that's the biggest thing. I think people are so scared of it not being perfect that they don't start. And I think the other, you know, exactly what Madeleine says about that sort of sense of just keeping going. My advice is, and it might be very different because, again, we have very different processes, but I absolutely believe in just getting a first draft down, come what may. Because I talk to a lot of young men and women who have got 3 beautiful chapters because they're endlessly working on the beginning, and then they can't quite work out what chapter 4 is, so are stuck. And so my advice is, well, never mind chapter 4, do chapter 5. If you know you've got a brilliant scene you want to write, it might be, you know, a wedding scene, or it might be whatever, just enjoy it, just write it. You don't have to write in order. You know, at the beginning of a draft, just get something down, and then you can sit back. I always use the idea of building a house. You have got to actually build the house before you can decide what color to paint the walls. And so that sense of just keeping going and not worrying about how good it is, not that perfect first sentence. And the phrase that I have always really enjoyed, which I think is what Madeleine and I do, is that you will do whatever you do. You might be working, you might be caring, you might be students, whatever it is, but you turn up. You don't go, do you know, I don't feel in the mood today, and therefore I'm not turning up. But there's this idea, you know, people often say, well, what if you're not in the mood? Well, you know, the Spanish artist Picasso, allegedly, was asked right at the end of his life by a young artist why, given he was one of the world's acknowledged greatest living painters, he still went to his studio every day. And his answer was, when inspiration arrives, I want it to find me working. So it's hard work, writing a book. And I think sometimes it's glamorized, isn't it, too much? So people, as you say, get discouraged because people expect it to be fun all the time. And it's the best job in the world, and it's wonderful, but it is really hard work. And once you accept that, then that's okay, because it should be hard. And we all have a soggy bit in the middle, don't we?
Mm-hmm. And I think I just want to pick up last thing on something you said about oftentimes when you're writing your first novel, you are doing a bunch of other stuff. You have your day job and maybe another job, and there's all this stuff going on. And I have found it really helpful to just think, well, I can do half an hour a day. I can find half an hour a day on this. And to just check in on the novel, check, you know, the steam from the kettle or whatever it is that you want to write about. But even just that's enough to keep you in the world of a novel. Half an hour is enough. And if you get inspired and want to do more, great. But that everyone can do half an hour a day. And sometimes if you start with that, then it's not so daunting as thinking, well, I need to find 3 hours at 5 a.m. in the morning, you know.
And I write more books than you. So that, but I mean, actually, that is quite an important point. I mean, you know, not just because I adore Madeleine's writing and indeed adore Madeleine, but one of the reasons that it's nice for us to talk is because actually almost everything that we do in terms of how we do it, the types of books we do, is so different. But all the things that matter we have in common. And it is that sort of sense of not letting yourself down, if you've decided you want to write a book, you just need to find the time to do it, don't you? But also be kind to yourself and be generous, I suppose, to yourself about it, and take joy. Take joy in writing. I think that's it, because we're both a bit tired at the moment, aren't we? So the thought of writing anything is like, oh, God. But I have a deadline for September, so I really should not be here. I should be writing. But hey-ho, here I am talking again.
Hi, this is kind of going off of what you've already been talking about, but you mentioned just in passing that you were a publisher. Does that play any part in how you write, or like what you write, or what was that trajectory like?
Thank you. Yes, I was a publisher back in the day. And I was an editor, so I worked in that side of publishing. And it has been enormously helpful and enormously not helpful in some respects. So it's enormously helpful because, exactly as Madeline said, and I said as well, I've therefore seen so many scripts right at the beginning of their lives. So I know the difference between, a published book and a script. And I think a lot of people, when they start out, really don't. And, one of my worst moments in publishing was, and I will not say which author it was, however, it is an author published by the same publishing company as mine, when I was a baby publisher, a secretary indeed, because people had secretaries in those days, and the new script of this multi-million selling author was delivered to the office, I will tell you later, and I dropped it in the post room. No page numbers. So I feel I own quite a lot of his royalties, frankly, because I put them back in the order I thought they should be. And it was hard to tell, frankly. So I learned all of those things. I also learned how to, and I was taught to edit. So I have very good structure and all of these things. But the flip side of that is I have very good structure. So sometimes I can write myself into a place where it is very solid, but it's not magical. It's not doing the thing. So oddly, my technique and control over a script sometimes gets in the way of it being free. And the thing that, a slightly different thing is, both Madeline and I have had very good fortune. It means that in publishing, I know what things mean. So when someone says to me, the sales rep in the UK says we've got X copies in airside, which sound tiny number, I know that that is a miracle and that they've done incredibly, because actually to have got 50 books into that particular, is wonderful. And then the converse is I also know what it all means. And because of the Women's Prize, which we haven't really talked about, because I spend a lot of time around publishers and publishing, I'm kind of an odd author to have, because actually I live in publishing in a weird way, and I deal with all the other publishers from a different point of view. And that's sometimes a good thing, and sometimes it's quite hard for me to be allowed to be an author and just let other people do the thing. And, I'm that terrible person when, if there weren't enough seats, I would have been putting them out. I'd been like, where are the seats? There were enough seats. It was lovely. Thank you. But, it's that sort of thing. So, I think it's, on balance, it's been a helpful thing. Because in the end, that's what we all want, isn't it? All I wanted when I left university was to hang about in books. So I hung around like that side of the fence, and then I've hopped over to this side of the fence.
Well, please join me in thanking Kate and Madeline for a fantastic conversation. Kate will be signing after, right at this table over here. So if you'd like to form a line starting right over here, that would be perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Brett. Can I just say thank you to you and everybody here for staying on to do this, and to my brilliant publishers who are here, and particularly to Madeline, who has come all the way just to do this and is leaving right now, not because she doesn't like you or anything, but she has got a train to catch. So she has green-sided the book. So I don't want you to feel guilty that you're running out on me, but you must not miss your train. No. Thank you all very much.